right, how's everybody doing? Can you hear me all right? Thumbs up? Good. So, I've got a big one tonight. Lots of stuff to cover. Um, and some of you it will be your last podcast while on the course. Now, of course, you're welcome to attend going forward. What I'm going to do is send out a link to those whose courses are ending. And then you could just, if you want to, you'll be on the list and you can hop on. And if not, that's fine too. So tonight, what I decided to do, particularly for those in 322, is talk about how things fit together. Because most of us, when we take these courses or study this material, can get a little bogged down with the gravity of the problems. Like there's a lot of issues out there that we have to deal with, and some of them, most of them are quite complex and multidimensional. So in order to deal with them, you have to have a background that you can look at things from a different perspectives and then piece together solutions that, and often are trade-offs. There's no ideal solution. There's always going to be some things that are going to have a little bit of a give and take. And this is for those in 322, that's what your last assignment's all about, is how do you kind of come up with a solution that has elements of both or all three imperatives. So the issue is to try and move forward as a global society while sustainably addressing the three major imperatives, which are the ecological imperative, to ensure that we don't destroy the life support systems that sustain us, the social imperative, to ensure that we are all healthy and socially well-functioning people in various levels and parts of our society. Then we have communication, democracy, we take care of one another. And then lastly, the economic imperative, to make sure that our economies work and they support what we're trying to do from an ecological and social standpoint. And often you'll get in these situations where one imperative will be promoted more than another one, and often there's a loggerhead between the economic imperative and the social and environmental imperative. That's often where you get a lot of the conflict in terms of priorities. However, I think if there's one thing that should be crystal clear right now, it's that if the economic imperative is not satisfied, if our economies are not working well, then the rest of it, well, the ecological imperative might do just fine, but our social imperative will not be satisfied, right? And so the pandemic's a really, really good example of how that works. It's like this giant experiment that we've been doing by literally shutting down economies for a period of time. And as we can see, it's sustainable. Can't do it, and this is where we're running into a lot of problems in certain parts of the world and trying to struggle with the reopening of our societies and economies. Safe reopening. So that's the challenge. The challenge is to find solutions that can balance the ecological, social, and economic imperatives. So I guess the first question is, are there solutions? Are there actually things and strategies and so forth that we can take that will achieve that? And my first answer is perhaps, is maybe there are, but at the same time, we're in very unprecedented times of pandemics, of social upheaval, and profound environmental action and profound environmental problems. So any solutions that we put on the table right now, I think it's safe to say we need to balance them. Solutions need to be balanced, right? So we need to balance equity solutions, social equity solutions with economically viable solutions, and then those that are ecologically sustainable. But there's some particular issues right now that I think probably will jump out for those that are in the area of sustainable development. They're pretty obvious to us based if you read anything, even the introductory courses. And those ones, I would say right now, at least a short list of them are climate change is a big issue. The loss of biodiversity and degradation of ecosystems globally is a big issue. Unemployment is a big issue, particularly right now. strife, so social upheaval. We're seeing that in the United States and elsewhere, where there's very big social problems. And then lastly, inequality, I think, is a very big issue that is closely linked to social strife. So the next question is, can we balance all of these imperatives? Can we actually do that? Well, ideally, yeah, but it doesn't always work out that way. So not always, actually, and I'm going to give you some examples. But we can try. We have to try to do this, and it's not always going to work out. And I'm going to start with some examples of where it hasn't worked out. What seemed like good ideas actually did not really work out that well right off the bat. So I would call these unbalanced or imbalanced solutions. So one that I've mentioned before is REDD+. So the solution to avoid deforestation of tropical rainforests, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then have economic compensation. So when it first started to be launched in 2007 and 8 and 9, on the surface it was really great. It seemed like a great idea. But when it got put into action, it was quite flawed, actually, the initial stages of REDD. And I'm going to put through a lot of links on this particular podcast, and you'll have the access to the PDF afterwards. But so I'm going to be prepared for a lot of links, and that's going to be a big part of this. This story here outlines the problems with REDD, and the problems with REDD right off the bat. In theory, it was great because you promoted conservation and biodiversity preservation and so forth. Whereas when it came out of the gates, it was fueled by some pretty big money that ended up being socially not the best solution, because a lot of people got pushed off their land. There was a big component of the social imperative that wasn't addressed in the early renditions of REDD. Now that has been remedied to some degree, and current day REDD projects are much more socially balanced than they initially were. But the problem was, it seemed like a good story right up the front, but we didn't have good balance for the social imperative. Another great example of an idea or an initiative that seemed like perfect at the time, or at least very good, but ended up not going so well. And this one was Solyndra. Now this is the one that the Republicans in the United States like to jump all over. Anybody familiar with Solyndra? You heard of this company? It's a solar company. It's a solar energy company, solar technology company. And the problem with Solyndra was they had good technology and it seemed to be at the right place at the right time, but their business model was relatively flawed up front. It wasn't a fully profitable company and it relied on subsidies. And sometimes this can be a big problem in green tech, in that often green tech companies, when they get launched or once they enter into the marketplace, they look good and they seem to be producing the right solutions, like reducing greenhouse gas emissions or whatever it is, purifying water, but they're only financially viable based on government subsidies. And the problem with that is it's great, and sometimes we need to do that. In fact, often cases we need to do that to get technologies launched into new spaces. But the problem is, over the long term, if a company is completely reliant on social subsidies, it's debatable whether or not that's a good company, like whether it is a sustainable solution in the long term. And Solyndra wasn't. They ended up going bankrupt, and they received a heck of a lot of government money at that time in the early 2011, 12, 13. So again, great idea, looks good, but was it economically viable? Doesn't seem as though it was. And here's another article. And so apparently they're still alive, and there's a new rendition of Solyndra. The point being, though, is that when we start to look at any initiative, we need to really have a hard look at the social, economic, and ecological dimensions of that solution to ensure that whether or not it will work. And if not, maybe it's not going to be sustainable, and maybe that's okay. But it would be foolish to not look at those dimensions. So, are we seeing action right now? Like, what are some good stories? Because quite often we can get caught up in the negativity around all of what is going on in the world. And there is actually a lot of stuff. And a lot of this, what I'm going to show you, is Canadian centric. So it's Canadian examples. So then there is actually a lot of stuff happening in Canada right now. And I'll give our federal government a fair degree of credit for that. But also there's just a lot of initiatives on the part of just Canadian organizations, regardless of the federal government. Number one, so I mentioned climate is a big issue. So one of the first things about any kind of initiative moving forward with climate change, and this is stuff I work on a lot with my team, is knowing the problem. So knowing the climate problem. We can't really, make a lot of progress on climate change unless we understand how that problem is impacting us. And this is an area that we are shining in right now. Canada as a country is doing some tremendous things in this area. And I've shown this before, so for some, this may be a repeat. So one of the things that has been launched in the last few years is the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. Okay, so here's the link. So go to that link. And this has been excellent. And this is an A+, like an A+ move by our current government to get this established. And you'd be surprised how poorly developed this is elsewhere in the world. So in the countries that I work on with my team in the Caribbean and elsewhere, they have basic MET services, so like measuring temperature and precipitation and all that kind of stuff. But climate services is a lot different, and you need to be clear about this in our domain. Climate services is not MET services. MET services is looking at the weather, basically, whereas climate is looking at systematic change over the long term. Long-term change, usually, well into the future. This is what the idea is, to look at mean changes in climate over a long period of time. And so in order to really have climate services, you need to have the capability to have data provided to you, which comes from models, right? So we have this established and launched in the last couple of years. This got launched, and this is fantastic. So anybody in Canada who's doing work in climate change now has access to this free, publicly available database, data supply resource, which can be used for anything. Like, I mean, if you want to do any kind of climate planning and so forth for a business, like looking at what you need to adapt to, what we can expect is going to happen in the future, this is amazing. And it's a public service, so that's another big bonus. And so if you go to that last link, the climatedata.ca, so for anybody that's in an organization that needs to look at, climate adaptation or what have you, this is really great stuff. So if you look at that and go to explore by location, I'm going to look at, say, I don't know, give me a place to look at. Someone give me some location in Canada. A city. Toronto, Lethbridge. Okay. I'll go with Lethbridge. No offense to Toronto, but Toronto Bridge. Okay. So I choose Lethbridge. Okay, so if I go to Lethbridge, I get their lat long, and then I'm able to see the temperature. I can see the graph. You can see, like, I'm going to put this through, and I believe you will be able to see this. That gives you the projected changes in climate based on different model outputs from today, from 1960, so that's historical, modeled historical and historical range, through to 2080 or 20. Usually what we do is we look at 2050 and 2100. Those are the kind of the major signposts, or I guess the time slots. So you can see that obviously when you look at the model output here, the error bars are there, but you have the hottest day, and then you have all of the different data you can expect. So this is very good when you start to look at how do we plan infrastructure, can we expect to happen in the future. And this is also, you have other variables, frost days, precipitation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you go through all this stuff, you will see the trends are pretty shocking, right? You can see what we expect to happen. And this is, if you look at a variety of different locations, I mean, imagine if you're running a ski resort, right? This is something you would want to look at say, okay, in 20 years, what can we expect the weather is going to be like? What can we see the average temperature in the winter will look like? So fantastic resource. I mean, this isn't fiction. This is backed by very good climate models. Okay, so that's going to help us know the climate problem so we can deal with whatever comes our way. The next issue is dealing with the climate problem. So dealing with the climate problem is all about mitigation. So what are some, it's very cool. How can they predict 80 years in the future? Good question. We do it with models. You know, we are relying on climate models. And the thing is, with this, how you can say, how can you do that? How can we reliably look at that? There's so many different variables. Well, there are, but it is a climate system. You know, climate systems are based on physical phenomena. And the one variable that we can't predict fully, or that will be the most variable, will be what the greenhouse gas emissions are. So that's the one thing that could change dramatically based on what things will look like 80 years in the future. However, if we just assume that things go in a certain direction, like say business as usual, those models are pretty accurate. You know, they give us a pretty good idea. Why? Because, you know, it's physics. It's based on physics, and we can look at parameterizing and validating those models by looking at history. So when you model back in history, that's where you really test the model, is say, because how can you validate something in the future? But you can validate stuff in the past. So you can look at, well, your model, which is based on, you know, climate physics and so forth, how well it can predict what the temperature was in, say, I don't know, 1801. So then the question is, well, how do you know that? Well, we can actually measure what the concentration of carbon was in the atmosphere in 1801 or previous to that by looking at ice cores. So carbon isotope tracing, and that is a measurement. So it's not like we're not modeling that, it's a measurement. And that's how you parameterize climate models, is by looking at, you know, previous realities, and then that's how you parameterize it, and then you run it and predict what will happen in the future. Now there are a lot of things that will influence that, say for instance, feedback processes and so forth. There's a lot of things that are really complicated as to if land cover changes significantly and so forth. But they're pretty good. They give us a rough idea of what we can expect. Okay. And it shows us what the cost of inaction is. Business as usual does not paint a very pretty picture for the future climate. Like, in business as usual means like we just keep on doing what we're doing. Okay, so mitigation. So that's a great resource. So if any of you end up working in climate adaptation or anything like that, you know where to look to get credible sort of data that will project what the future will look like from could look like from a climate standpoint. So mitigation. How do we deal with the climate problem? Well, this is an interesting area because that means that we need to transfer. The implicit assumption in here is that we are transforming our climate systems. So is there anything happening in this regard, or is it just kind of the same old, same old? Well, there is actually a lot of really good stuff happening all over the place in Canada. And these are some of the initiatives that are going on in the market per se. So the first one here is something from University of Alberta, which is called Future Energy Systems. So it's a research institute, I guess. But this is a really good resource to see what is going on in Canada with respect to renewable energy. Okay, so if you go to this link here, this will take you to their website, which has a map that shows you, and you can select anywhere in Canada. So let's say if you just wanted to look at Quebec, or if you just wanted to look at Ontario or whatever, it shows you when they were established, what they are, and their location and their capacity, which is like, usually it's in megawatts, right? So you can go around, and if you want to just look at, say, the ones that are just geothermal, just hydroelectric, solar, tidal, wind, you can select that, and then also look at whether it's municipal, private, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can also take a look at different time frames, right? So if you just want to look at, say, the last, whatever, 10 years, you can make that selection. Really, really good snapshot of what's going on. And you can also see the distribution of what's happening. So how much biomass, there's actually a fair bit of biomass happening, which is great, as opposed to, I mean, obviously one of the ones that jumps out, if you look at that, it's hydro, right? Because we have a lot of hydro in Canada. So a great resource for seeing like what is going on right now and has been happening to deal with that issue, mitigation. The other thing is companies. So who's doing what in Canada, right? Are we just sitting on the fence? And we get accused of that often. But we actually have some pretty good companies that are working in this space. Now, the sad part is they're doing most of their business outside of Canada, but nonetheless, they're here. So one of the big ones in solar is this company called Canadian Solar, and some of you may have heard of them. But they do a ton of work in solar, very big solar projects, mostly outside of Canada, as I mentioned, but they are a Canadian company. So Canadian Solar is doing a lot of stuff. If you want to talk about wind, you need not look further than Quebec for wind in Canada. Hydro-Quebec is a major player in wind in Canada. They have been doing wind for quite some time. They've got a natural fit. They're working a lot on the integration of their hydro systems and their wind systems, which is complicated because you're getting, the problem with the challenge with renewables, particularly wind and solar, is they're highly variable. It's not always sunny, nor is it always windy. So when you're dealing with energy management, there's this unsteady flow of energy coming into your grid. So you have to account for that through storage and management of that variable flow into it. But this is something they're very familiar with. They've been dealing with it for a lot, and they've got some very substantial wind farms in Quebec, around Gaspé and so forth, if you're not familiar with that. So check out them. So solar and wind is happening. Hydrogen, right? So hydrogen is it's still one of the kind of the one that people don't talk about a lot. It hasn't received as much attention, but Canada has been an early adopter and active country in hydrogen for quite some time. And so hopefully you're familiar with his company, which is a BC-based company, Ballard. So everybody familiar with Ballard? You've heard of Ballard Energy before? Yes? No? Anybody not familiar with Ballard? Anybody never heard of Ballard before? Okay, so good to know of them. So Ballard is a Canadian company. They're the fuel cell company, right? So they are one of the first companies to use a fuel cell to power a bus. In fact, one of my former professors from Royal Roads was heavily involved with the Ballard bus when they first started and when they actually got it to work. And I remember having a lecture from the engineer who was running that project at Royal Roads who talked about the first time the bus worked, which was an amazing lecture. So Ballard is here. They're happening. They're doing quite well. I think they've got 900 plus employees. They're manufacturing, distributing their technology around the world. So hydrogen is not just about fuel cells. There's a lot of dimensions to this hydrogen economy. And one of them is distribution, right? So here's some work that's being done from something called PIX. Is everybody familiar with PIX? PIX is the Pacific Institute for Climate Studies. So PIX has done some work on looking at the roadmap for hydrogen distribution. This link there shows you the work that they're doing in BC for seeing what this network for future hydrogen supply could be, because you need to think about that stuff, right? Same with electricity for charging stations for Teslas, and very similar problem with hydrogen, because we need to have distribution systems set up. And one of the great thinkers in the hydrogen area is in BC, Canadian. His name is Dr. David Sanborn Scott, and he is at UVic. So here's a link to him. This guy, again, I had a lecture from him while I was at Royal Roads a long time ago, but a fantastic mind, and really knows the hydrogen technology part of it and the framework for realizing that. right? And so he's written a great book called Smelling Land that I recommend you take a look at. And he is also active in the research area because he's the director and started the Institute for Energy Systems at UVic. So this group here at UVic is doing tremendous stuff in what's the technology that we need to think about for distributed, sustainable energy systems. Okay, so very good group to look at for the future of energy, and that's mitigation, and it's right here in Canada. So another dimension of this problem is adapting to climate change. So there's mitigation, but then there's adaptation, right? So and the big problem with the big issue with climate is we have to deal with these things. There's certain changes that we're seeing right now and that we will see more of that we have to adapt to. One of those is disasters. So we've seen the increased frequency of floods, we've seen the increase of forest fires and so forth, and that means we're going to have to be able to cope with them, right? So our infrastructure needs to be up to snuff. So here's a program that has come from Infrastructure Canada, which is a fund focused on developing infrastructure that can help deal with these kind of disasters, because we've seen that in some cases we were not prepared. So the government is active. I think that's a $2 billion fund, if I'm not mistaken, for, let's see, yeah, $2 billion. So the government launched Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, DMAF, a national merit-based program that will invest to support large-scale infrastructure projects to help better manage risks triggered by natural disasters. So this will be floods, droughts, and so forth. And that's linked to our action, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. So clearly there's financing and there's attention being paid to that part of it. Now, in terms of research, there's a lot that needs to be done in this area, and there is some really good work being done through a research institute in Waterloo, that they're pan-Canadian, but a lot of their people at University of Waterloo, that is funded and promoted by Intact Insurance, right? So this is the Intact Center for Climate Adaptation. So why do you think Intact is so heavily involved with this? What do you think, what would be their interest in this area? Because they obviously have to invest money and resources in supporting this work in this center. Why do you think that is? Why are they involved? Not losing money with building class. They're an insurance company who could lose a lot if worst case scenarios come to fruition. Absolutely. So is it about being a good person? In part, I think, yes. But there's also a business component to that. Insurance companies and reinsurance companies have a lot to lose, as does society, if we don't have a very good handle on the risks that are coming up. I just purchased a bunch of insurance yesterday, and yeah, my rates were higher. Let me put it to you that way. And so when we get these catastrophic losses and these incidents that come up, if we're not prepared for that, if we don't know what these risks are, then the losses can be quite significant for society, for individuals, but then also for the companies that are working in the insurance space, right? So Intact Center for Climate Adaptation is really focused on that work, and they've been at it for a bit. They're not brand new. So another one, so that's climate adaptation, but food provision is another big area that we need to think, right? Because as we saw with the Lethbridge example, I mean, the future climate reality most likely will be quite a bit different than what we experience today. So that means our agricultural industries are going to need to pay attention to that, right? So this is an initiative in BC. It's through the BC Ag Climate Action Program, where they're looking at regional strategies. This is for Vancouver Island to deal with future climate change. So in the food area, in the ag space, which I do a bit of work in, you have to think about what crops may or may not be viable in the future, right? So what will climate look like, and does that mean we can grow what we're growing right now? And so it may not mean. We may need to shift crops. We may need to use different practices. Agroforestry, and this is a lot of the stuff that we deal with in some of the developing world, where we expect to have greater frequency of droughts. So we need to think about crops that might be less vulnerable to droughts, right? Another one here is from NRCan. So NRCan actually has has been at this for a while as well. So NRCan is Natural Resources Canada. So these are the groups that will look at, say, mining and forestry and all the natural resource industries that we have in our country. And they've developed a climate impacts and adaptation platform. So if you go to that website, very extensive actually what they're doing in terms of Canada's climate change adaptation platform and looking at the future and what we may need to think about when it comes to forestry, right? So this has been around since 2012, so it's not new, but they have a lot of experts they draw on, and they do a lot of kind of sharing of best practices and how policy needs to be changed and so forth, are informed by different research that we're doing with respect to what the future climate may look like, right? So they have different working groups. So if you look at working groups there, you can see that we have, there's working groups on forestry, energy, economics, coastal management, biodiversity adaptation, ag, mining, how to measure progress in northern communities. A lot of work needs to be done on different aspects of our society, okay? So they have working groups that are looking at. So these usually are comprised of people who are researchers or experts, either from a practical standpoint or in the research world, who can help craft policy that makes a lot of sense. But this is happening, right? So one of the points that I'm trying to get across here is that it's not like we're sitting here doing nothing. There are a lot of things happening. Sometimes it may seem frustrating that we're not making fast enough progress, but I assure you things are working. So one of the big things, those are like, I think what I've shown you thus far is the ideal, right? Like the ideal world of mitigation where we can have hydrogen, solar, and wind, and all this good stuff. But the reality is, you know, I have to fly tomorrow, and the flight I'm going to take is not powered by electricity that comes from a wind power plant farm or solar panels or even a hydro rig. It is not. It's going to burn hydrocarbons to take us up into the air and move us through the air and take me to where I need to go. And that's going to remain that way for quite some time. And this is the reality. So our economies are dependent on fossil fuels. So in order to transition to a more sustainable world and economy, we need to recognize that and appreciate that, and then also find ways to balance some of these trade-offs. And this is where we are balancing the economic and technological constraints that we're under with the ecological imperative, right? That's the big trade-off there. So trade-offs are important, and I know some of you are in Alberta, so there's no better place to demonstrate that than Alberta. And I've worked a fair bit there, and I appreciate what the situation is in Alberta. So there are some really impressive things happening in the energy sector with respect to finding the best ways to manage these trade-offs, okay? And the first one I'm going to show you is a group called COSIA. And so, and this stands for the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. So some of you are probably shuddering right now because I've just mentioned, you know, the imperatives for sustainable development and the oil sands in the same sentence. And I understand that, appreciate that, but that is a reality that we have to deal with. So if you look, and COSIA is doing some pretty impressive things. So if you look at COSIA, you will see that they've got kind of a catalyst for innovation in technology and processes and practices to help reduce the impacts of greenhouse gases on land and tailings and water quality. So take some time to look around their site and see what they are doing to help kind of promote or at least reduce the impacts of the work that's being done in the oil sands. Now, I'll do something about COSIA at COP, whatever it was, 2016, climate change COP in Paris. So when the Paris Agreement was launched, I was there, and Of all of the organizations in the energy sector, Canadian energy sector, the only one that I saw that was there was COSIA. So they are actively participating and have been for a while in this climate problem. So they are not an organization that's hiding from it. They were there front and center, and I met with them while I was there and was impressed that they were there, as others did not go. So COSIA is quite interesting. And another group that's doing some neat stuff. The issue that we have to deal with is, so the issue with the energy sector, well, one of them, there's a few, obviously, is greenhouse gas emissions, right? So extracting, upgrading, and transporting heavy oil, like oil sands and bitumen or deleted bitumen, requires energy, requires resources, and results in greenhouse gas emissions. So how do we deal with that? Are we going to have zero emission upgrading of heavy oil? Well, probably not. So we have to find ways of dealing with those emissions. And one of those ways is through capturing them and transporting them and attempting to use those emissions for other things, right? So it's called CCS, carbon capture and storage. And as it turns out, Alberta or Albertan organizations are leaders in CCS. We don't hear a lot of that, but they are. And this is a little bit of information about what is going on in CCS in Alberta. Okay, so that's some information about the initiatives in Alberta for carbon capture and storage, right? That's from the government. There's they give you some list about, what the projects are. And one of them that I find very impressive, when I first learned about it, I was blown away, which is what's listed there is the Alberta Carbon Trunk Link, which is it's a pipeline that is used for transporting carbon emissions that otherwise would go into the atmosphere to areas where they can be used. It's like a big carbon emission transport pipeline. That's what the trunk line is. Okay, and this is, if you look at, this is run by a group called, I think it's run by, I'm not sure, if you correct me if I'm wrong, if they're not running it or if they're just using it, is Enhance Energy, which is an Alberta-based CCS company. Okay, so I met with them a while ago and was again thoroughly impressed with what they're doing, because it's very practical. They're capturing those emissions and transporting them. Now, in their case, Enhance, what their business model is capturing those emissions and then utilizing them for enhanced recovery. So for wells that have not been completely depleted, they can inject the CO2 into the well to get that remaining oil out. So, obviously you can say that, well, that's not the best use of that, but it is, they're using that in an economically efficient way. And we'll find other ways to use it. That's the thing. We're going to find other ways to use those greenhouse gas emissions, making products, carbon fiber, what have you. And then there's this last link, which gives you a better perspective on what that looks like, which is this, I believe on this link, you can see it. Okay, so if you go to that link I just sent here, this one. So go to that link and you will see a map. This is an older article, but this shows you where that actual link, that pipeline goes from north all the way down to the south. Okay? So again, when you think about all of the engineering that goes into this, it's incredibly impressive that we can actually do this. SAGD, well, frankly, to me, I went to my first SAGD plant a few years ago, and I just couldn't believe we actually were able to do that, despite all the impacts and so forth. But the fact that we can actually successfully do that was pretty impressive to me from an engineering standpoint alone. Okay, so that's about trade-offs, right? We have an energy sector which is dependent on natural gas and oil of various types, from heavy oil through to lighter oil. And we have to manage those trade-offs. That's just the reality of the situation. Okay? So what about biodiversity, though? Like switching to another area altogether, right? So we've talked about biodiversity in the courses and the problem. So If you look at the planetary boundaries literature by Rockstrom et al., biodiversity and ecosystems are in trouble globally. We are losing a lot of species at a very fast rate, and ecosystem services and the ecosystems that support them, which are the lifeblood of our society globally, are being degraded. So biodiversity is that underlying supporting ecosystem service. Like, it supports all of the other things that give us what we need: fresh water, food provision, climate regulation, and so forth, is supported by biodiversity. It's this complex matrix that allows nature to work, right? So, and biodiversity is being depleted. So how do we deal with that, right? And if anybody's worked in biodiversity over the past 20 years, you know that it's very rudimentary, right? Like, a lot of the times where you need to do a baseline assessment, you basically take a string, or we used to do this, you take a string and like go from A to B, and then you walk along that string and you count the species, right? You count what you see, and then you get, that's your diversity index, the species richness, right? I don't know if any of you have ever done that, but that is what, we still do today sometimes, and we've done for years. But is that the best way to do it? Is it the most accurate? Not at all, because we can only count so much and see so much. But this is amazing. And again, I met these folks a few years ago, and when they showed me what they're doing, it was at a conference, I was absolutely blown away. And they're called IBAL. Okay? This is IBO, International Barcode of Life Project. So this was and is a technology that started at the University of Guelph, which is in Ontario, and they have developed a system in which they can take like a bunch of material, right? So if you go and sample some moss and just to take a big lot of something, you put it in their machine, and then it goes and through and deciphers all the genetic material that is in that bunch of whatever you put in there, right? And so then you establish a database of the genetic code of different species, and that's why it's called the barcode of life. And each species has its own barcode, basically genetic barcode. And so you establish a database of all of that stuff, and then you can quickly then go and sample, and see the amount of diversity in that sample that you've just taken, right? So I'm giving a pretty quick overview of what they can do, but spend some time to look at what they're doing. And I recall when I first saw it, I guess it was 5 years ago, I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, this is revolutionary technology. You can use it for this, you can use it for that. Now, very cool. This is amazing what they're doing. It's amazing. So that was 5 years ago when I first saw them. I was blown away then. And I thought, I would love to use that for doing EIAs, environmental impact assessment, right? So you can use that to do baseline studies. And then for monitoring, you follow up, especially for site restoration. So if there's a mine or something like that, you've done the baseline, and then you want to monitor how much biodiversity has been restored, use that, right? So only today today, I'm having meetings with companies that want to start to use this technology, right? In fact, last week I had a meeting with a group that is starting to use this for doing monitoring the progress made for reclamations, like mining site reclamation. But again, this would not be possible were it not for having that innovative technology. We're also seeing IBAL use their technology in doing biodiversity assessments in the countries that we're working in right now, like in Antigua and St. Lucia and so forth. There's research being done on logging it. That's a big. Usually, you just go and sample stuff, and you have this big kind of room filled with like leaves and all that kind of stuff, and you have to do the taxonomic work. But using this, you go and sample the leaves, and you go, and it's going to give you the genetic code of all of the different things you've picked up, and will allow you to do an inventory much faster and way more accurately than you could before, right? It's bad news for taxonomists because this essentially is eliminating the need for having that kind of laborious taxonomic that is traditionally done. But at the same time, we'll still always need taxonomists for verifying things and so forth. But it's amazing stuff, right? And I see tremendous potential for this kind of technology, which is Canadian, right? And so back to my previous point about the need for subsidizing this work at the early stage, that initial work was funded through, I think, a network of excellence grant from the Liberals, the Paul Martin Liberals. which was quite a while ago, initially gave them the money to start that work, because you need to start at ground zero doing the development work for something like that. I mean, that's a lot of knowledge you need to put into something to just understand how to code. Like how do you do the genetics side of that? How do you get the technology to work? You need tons of dough to put into a program just to do the research. Then you can get to the technology, and then you can get to deployment. So we're talking like 20 years likely of development of this in order to get to the point today where we're actually looking at using it. So like I don't want to kind of say that we shouldn't be investing, and we absolutely should be, but at the same time we need to have one eye on the innovation and then the other eye on whether it makes economic sense. And maybe it doesn't, which is fine. It's in the research land. But in this case, this technology is going to be amazing. I'm telling you right now, for what we can do with EIAs, what we can do with biodiversity monitoring and all that kind of stuff. It's amazing, and it's Canadian, which is phenomenal. So another part of the biodiversity problem, or challenge, I guess you could say, is policy. Like we can measure biodiversity, but we need to make decisions about it. So guess what? Well, we have this group, which is a group that I've worked with a lot, the CBD in Montreal, which is the UN Convention for Biological Diversity. So the CBD is the body, like Climate Change Convention, that gets everybody together, all the countries, to determine how we're going to better manage our societies in relation to the natural world. So conservation, sustainable use, use of biological information, all that kind of stuff. And CBD is filled with tremendously knowledgeable and talented people that are working every day on this issue. And their secretariat is in Montreal in Canada, right? So that's here. And this is where a lot of that great work is happening. I mean, it's happening around the world with the different parties and the countries, but the secretariat where the people convene and then organize everything and formulate policy internationally is in Canada. Okay, so lots of stuff happening there. So that's the climate change, biodiversity, but what about the social imperatives? So those in 322 know that sustainable development isn't just about biodiversity and nature, it's about our society, right? It's about social capital. It's about making sure that we have a fair society, a democratic and inclusive and compassionate society. So how do we enhance the social imperative? Is it being enhanced? One might argue that it is not if you looked at the news on any given night. But fortunately, if we look at the Canadian example, I think we're doing pretty good. And there's a lot of exciting things happening along these lines. So one area that I want to highlight for you is this area of social entrepreneurship. So if you haven't heard of this, this is a movement that is really growing tremendously around the world, but particularly there's a lot of really good work happening in Canada on this front. So this first link here is to BDC, which is a Business Development Bank of Canada, which is kind of like a crown corporation, and they are big into this. They are big into helping support and finance and give loans and so forth to companies that have like a social mission. They call it social entrepreneurship. And so this outlines their perspective on that and what they believe and what they want to see happen. So for instance, they support the B Corp certification for those in 660, big into B corporations. They want to see more and more B Corps and want to support B corporations. So BDC is very big into that, right? So the Unscented company is a Canadian company that does, environmentally responsible cleaning products. They're a B corporation. They're supported, or the BDC is a big fan of the Unscented company. You have a lot more interest on the part of the Canadian government in this area of social entrepreneurship. Here's a link to Employment Social Development Canada's support for social enterprises by young people, right? So this is trying to create opportunities for young people to be entrepreneurs to create solutions to social problems. Now, obviously, this doesn't always work out well as we're looking at the we situation in Canada right now. We have to do this right. I don't think that what they were doing is the right way to do things, but it is possible, right? It's possible to have the support for these programs. And there's bank support, right? So one of the more conservative institutions in Canada, one that I deal with a lot is RBC. So RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, a big fan of sustainability, community support for social finance, social entrepreneurs, right? And they if you go to that link, RBC's programs there, they give support to these different groups. So you have Ashoka Canada. It's a social network. It's a network of social entrepreneurs. Futurepreneur for entrepreneurs at every stage of business. Leap Center for Social Impact. So that's more about charities and so forth. And then Venture for Canada, which is for more startups. So social entrepreneurship is not just about, making businesses. Social entrepreneurship is also about just supporting organizations that are attempting to achieve positive social outcomes, right? So this could be like gender empowerment, it could be poverty alleviation, food security, et cetera, et cetera. So another group in the innovation space that I think is doing quite great stuff on an everyday basis is in Montreal, and they're called District 3, D3. So they're an incubator, they're like an accelerator incubator from Concordia University, which gives resources to groups that come up with new technologies and so forth that can, potentially be turned into viable businesses. But they have a big emphasis on social innovation within what they do. So they like to see companies or organizations that are moving forward the social imperative. In fact, I had a meeting with the group last week. Just one sec. They have this technology that developed for seeing whales. What are they called? Whale sensing. I'm trying to find their link right now. Whale watch. I'll put it through. I will put this in the link. I don't want to lose the time right now. Whale funding. That's what they're called. So this group, which is in District 3, whale finders. There we go. Okay, I will put it through. I don't have it right off the top of my head right now. But they're in District 3. Again, they're using technology, satellite-based remote sensing and drones for an AI to help locate where whales are. So this can be used to help reduce the impact on whales from and all that kind of stuff. And they're doing tremendous work. But again, I don't think they are able to do what they're doing because they have an environment like District 3 to develop their business, right? But this isn't just about technology and just about business. This imperative, social imperative, is also about just doing things about the principle of it, right? And there are so many ways that that's being advanced right now across Canada and the world. This is one group that I work with right now on their board. It's called Food for the Poor. And they're just purely a charity, but what they do, what we do, is we build schools and have programs for impoverished societies and throughout the Caribbean and America, right? And that's a big problem. A lot of people just simply don't have a school to go to in many communities. So our mission is to create those schools and provide relief, particularly right now with COVID. It's terrible, to help those organizations out. Another great one in Canada is called CARE, this group here. Again, a big emphasis on women and young girls in helping to promote inequality in developing countries. So through education, through providing support and so forth, doing tremendous work. I haven't worked with them, but they're doing great stuff. Another great one that I like a lot, this is a fantastic one, is called Seva. I've never heard of Seva, but this is a group that I've donated to, and they are the ones that send doctors to different countries that have a disproportionate amount of people with cataracts. So Nepal, they do a lot of work in Nepal because of the elevation in Nepal, they're exposed to higher amounts of radiation, which causes cataracts to form. So they send these doctors who are all volunteers to go around clinics and do cataract surgery. So many of them couldn't see, right? They're blind. And once they have the cataract surgery, which is, doable, they can have their vision back, right? And so I love Seva because it's such a tangible return from the money that they get, and their overhead is really low. They do tremendous work. So again, giving people sight, and it's a very clear, like you give them X dollars, and that will translate into the number of eyes that they're going to operate on. And then one last group that I have some experience with from a long time ago is not Canadian, but in fact started by Canadians, which is called Casa Guatemala. So has anybody heard of this group before, Casa Guatemala? Yes, no, no? Okay, so this group is a charity based in Guatemala in the east, in an area called Rio Dulce, which is it's an orphanage. So what they do is they provide housing, food, clothing, support, and everything for children up until about 14 years old from Guatemala. And the thing with the Guatemala is that often families just simply can't afford to support their children. So it's not like they're just left nowhere. Their families can't afford to give them good food and education. So they then go to Casa Guatemala, where they live with other children, and it's run like a school, a boarding school, basically. So I volunteered with them a long time ago, like in 1996, and was there for about a month. And they take in volunteers, and it's tremendous. These kids really would not have any other option, would probably end up on the street if they didn't have that option. And it was I mean, when I did that, it was a life-changing experience for me. I was Mr. Corporate guy in engineering and doing software, and then I went and spent like 6 and 7 months in that part of the world, and part of which was with Casa Guatemala. And you come back from something like that, and you see the world in a different way, right? We take for granted having families and having food and shelter. Those kids didn't have that, right? And so you see the effect of not having that, but also you see the effect of providing that for kids. And I was a teacher there. I taught them science and stuff, and sports and basketball. So, I mean, again, there's no really entrepreneurial side to that, but that's just like providing help for people that need it. And there's so many different ways that is happening right now. So despite all the negative news out there, there are these organizations at the grassroots, and there's also these initiatives that are really doing positive things that can help other people out, and to advance that very important part of things, which is the social imperative. So the last component of this is the economic imperative, right? So how do we start to realize this green economy that we're wanting to see happen? And we can't ignore the fact that the economic component of things is a very important one. So within Canada, we have a group called SDTC. Some of you may be familiar with them, Sustainable Development Technology Canada. So SDTC, again, is an organization that helps to finance green technology, right? So if you go to that website, SDTC, now it's a little more larger scale. Like SDTC, if they're going to get involved with something, it has to be pretty substantial. And you can see the companies, if you go to that website, you'll see the companies that they're investing in are, they're pretty big. So they're like in, I don't know, advanced intelligence systems, tree stress optimization, soil reading, a lot of like energy related things. But you have to really, this is not early stage stuff. They're not an early stage, I've got an idea type of thing. They tend to want to come in where they've got this, an established technology that's working, that needs to be scaled up. And they're doing great stuff, and they feel definitely a strong need. But their due diligence process is pretty intense. So you kind of have to, you have to have your stuff together before you go to SDTC. But the fact that we have is great, because that's taking innovations like the Barcode of Life project. When they were first doing their stuff, they wouldn't go to SDTC. Once they got like commercially, like when they got a technology working, they may have approached them. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if SDTC has funded some of what they're doing. Okay, so they're like operationalizing the technology revolution that needs to happen to build a green economy. But we also need, as those in environmental economics would know, we need to think about finance in a different way, right? So the CPA group, the Canadian Professional Accountants Association of Canada, has a whole initiative devoted towards sustainable finance, climate adaptation, and how do we need to look at accounting differently in Canada. So our body that certifies every accountant in Canada is working on this as well. Government attention to sustainable finance. So this isn't an issue that's escaping the federal government. This is an initiative in the federal government that's looking at what is sustainable finance. So they've developed an expert panel on sustainable finance. This report here, the final report on expert panel on sustainable finance, mobilizing finance for sustainable growth. You can take a look at that PDF, and that goes through a lot of the different dimensions of what they recognize as needed for sustainable finance in Canada. So climate adaptation and all the different dimensions of sustainability that need to be addressed in how we run our country. So like support for Canada's oil and natural gas industry for building low emissions and making it globally competitive. That's a recommendation that they have. So COSIA would be part of that, I would think, right? So that's something to look at in terms of how that is happening. Education. So for instance, if this is something that really turns your crank, there are programs that are devoted, like Royal Roads, but even more focused on sustainable finance. This is a group in Concordia University at JMSB, the John Molson School of Business, which gives certificates and trains you in sustainable finance. So if you wanted to be a finance professional and focus on sustainable finance, like how to invest in green funds and all that kind of stuff, they have a certificate program that trains you to do that, and it's a good one. So that's happening. So that's another sign that there's a transition happening. And then another program in sustainable finance, more on the research side of things, is this one at Queen's, which is the Center for Sustainable Finance at Queen's University. So these folks are doing some really good work on more of the how do we shape a sustainable future by using finance as this tool to do that. Like, what is it, and so forth. How do we deal with capital in a different way? And this is really impressive stuff that they're starting to do. And all this is relatively new, right? This isn't 10 years ago, this wasn't around. And then the last thing I'd like to show you is and this is really interesting, I would think, for those in the environmental accounting, environmental management tool 660 and 560, is the Eco-Fiscal Commission. So if you look at what these folks are doing, this is a commission, so it's comprised of experts from different universities and so forth, that looks at practical solutions for growing prosperity, specifically looking at things like carbon pricing, right? And how do we go about making carbon pricing work, and all that kind of stuff. And this is a very important work that needs to happen. Why? Because if we don't do this work, we will set unrealistic prices that will hinder our industrial development, ultimately not work, and not have a sustainability over the long run. Much like we saw with things like Solyndra and so forth, where it looks like a good, or even Red Plus, where it looks like a good idea, but the proper thought wasn't necessarily put into those decisions. So the Eco-Fiscal Commission is the group of researchers who are looking at this kind of stuff very, very intensely to see how we can move forward with pricing pollution and so forth. And for 660 and 560, that's pricing externalities, which again is complicated stuff, and we need to get it right. All right, so where to? To conclude, where do we go from here? Well, we need leadership at the top, clarity. We need clear, practical solutions from the government. I've shown you some of the initiatives that we have. Climate data, for instance, for adaptation, very necessary. Some of the adaptation platform, disaster relief, and so forth. We need this to be held accountable. We also need held accountable. So we can have initiatives, but we need to be held accountable as a country for our commitments to these international commitments, and we have to be accountable to the taxpayer. That's the government's role. They need to put in policies in place that will help us realize our commitments at the international level, say for climate change, biodiversity, and so forth. But those need to be fiscally smart. They need to be accountable to the taxpayers, which we've seen some problems with that as of late. So we need continued sustainable innovation at all scales. So I've shown you different things. I've shown you companies. I've shown you organizations and new initiatives, but SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprise, large corporations, NGOs, community-based organizations, charities, unions, etc., all need to be moving in this direction. We need more research and design. So I've shown you some of the work that's happening at Guelph and Queens, Concordia, Royal Roads, UBC, UVic. Need more of that. Sustainability now is just at the initial part of things. This is now going to be a design constraint for pretty much everything going forward. So we got to figure out a lot of these things out, like the Ecofiscal Commission is doing that finance. And we need results, right? That's at the end of the day, things need to really produce results, because talk is cheap and results, those are the things that really have value. So lastly, you have a role to play in this. Like each of you who's on this is studying this stuff, and you have a role to play in some way, shape, or form, whether it means you're working in industry, or whether working in finance, whether you want to get involved in technology development, whether you want to volunteer and go to a place like Casa Guatemala or wherever else. All that stuff adds up, and it's all important, and you can play a role in a lot of different ways. So there's no lack of opportunity for you to really engage with this stuff and carve out a living for yourself, and also make some tangible progress. So there we go. I mean, that's how the landscape right now, as I see it, in terms of things that are happening to try and kind of connect the social, the economic, and the ecological imperatives and create solutions going forward. So any questions? I know there's a lot of stuff there. All of it's going to be available for download in the link in the YouTube video, for the PDF, so you'll have access to all of these links there. Does anybody see a fit for what they want to do there? Eyeball, there you go. Go there. I would recommend you go there. They're extremely nice people. The guy, what's his name? Just a sec. See how it works. Like, depends on what are you working on? Like right now, I'm gonna get his name. About there's a guy, Paul, I think his name is. I'll find his name. Oh my gosh, I can't find it right now. But he's the I don't think it's, I can't see, I'm just going to look for, anyway, one of the leading scientists for eyeball is a great guy. He's a great guy. Very, very nice. The people there are amazing. I mean, I don't know, it depends where you are. Where are you, Sarah? Are you in Alberta? Calgary. And what are you doing right now? Like, I mean, I know you're studying at Royal Roads, but are you working as well? Remote camera study in the city. Okay, well, there you go. What if you were to see if you can use, you know, biodiversity sampling, remote camera study, like sampling stuff using cameras, looking at. Yeah, I mean, it's something you could add to that. Like for me, what I'm interested in doing is putting remote sensing together with that. So you look at stuff from space and then you sample it on the ground. Yeah, we would you get a better handle on biodiversity in the city for sure. So me, what I'd like to do is use their technology to go and sample stuff in wherever, like where I'm working right now. I'm not Haida right now because I can't go there, but Haida, Belacula, Amazonia, Antigua, all over the place, and then sample it on the ground and then connect that to geospatial platforms so you could see geospatially the distribution of biodiversity And then find ways to look at, like, you sample a few places and then you kind of use the remote sensing to give you an index as to what the biodiversity could be over much larger scales based on your ground-based sample. That's what I want to do with it. That's amazing stuff. But, look at it, pitch it to whoever you're working with, say, hey, we should use this. And then I'm sure there's ways to use it. But I can tell you this, if you go there and email in advance, they are very friendly people and they will welcome you and they'll welcome what you want to do. In some ways, they kind of have an obligation because they've received a lot of taxpayer money to do what they're doing. So, good. Anybody else? Anybody want to go to Guatemala? Go for it. It's a little more dangerous these days than I understand, but I would recommend it. Can you sneak in now? I don't know, actually. I think right now would be not the best time to go to Casa Guatemala. I'll tell you this, though. If you want to go and have a changing experience, it is worth doing. I swear to you. I went there with an open mind. So the way it used to work anyway, you show up, you send an email in advance. They have a minimum stay of used to be 3 weeks. You'd have to commit 3 weeks because they don't want just people coming in for the day and stuff. And then you go there and you get a bed and you get a food, like 3 meals a day with everybody else, with the kids. And then you help out. The first time I showed up, and you get there by boat. You go to Rio Doce and you take a boat down to the river. It's only accessible by boat to their land where they have everything. And you arrive, and then there's all these kids there, and it's amazing. I met great people there from all around the world. And I arrived, and within an hour of arriving, I was feeding kids and getting them ready for bed and stuff. And yeah, it was crazy. Language issues. Yeah, good to know Spanish. I spoke Spanish, so it's good to know some Spanish. I would recommend, but that's part of it, right? It's an educational vacation. You learn some Spanish, you learn some basic stuff, work on Spanish while you're there. You don't need to be fluent. They're kids, right? Most people speak English. I was one of the few people that spoke pretty good Spanish, but you can get by with basic Spanish. But you'll learn some. That'll be part of your experience. But yeah, it's so eye-opening. I'm telling you, it was intense and good. Hard work, but good. That was one of my most vivid memories. Was being there. It's a bit sad, but it's good. But they're actually in good shape. They're not like some orphanages. The kids they're malnourished and stuff. These kids are taken care of. They got school. They play with. They have it's pretty good. There's no weird stuff. It's pretty well managed. So check it out, or do something else. I don't know. There's other things you can do. Anybody else? Anybody else want to work in renewable energy and climate adaptation? You know where to go. If you're interested in wind, look at Hydro-Quebec. Good. All right. Well, that was a long one. One day, airplanes will operate with solar energy. I hope. I've got a friend who used to work for, what's that company that do the engines? Not General Dynamics, but whatever. They do engines. And he says, they're never going to get a blah, blah, blah. I'm like, come on. We'll have electric powered planes at some point. And the electricity will come from, solar, hydrogen, hydro, whatever, like Teslas. We'll have airborne Teslas, I believe. Probably sooner than we think, actually. All right. Thank you for coming out. It was a pleasure. Hopefully this was beneficial. And we will sign off. Mark's happening, so if you're waiting for stuff, it's coming. Just there's a lot to do right now. So that's 660 coming, 322 coming, 560 almost there.